Hi, John. We're going to take a look at your aesthetics and control, as well as the sun as key posting here. So let's call it up here, share screen, and let's take a look. Um, Aesthetics and control. We've got the four components to hold, how deep, um, equivalent exposures, and then the better. So got that one, and exposures. Looks like the exposures are a bit dark, but we'll get to those. And then better. But looks like they're all there. All right, let's take a look at what we have here. So the shutter speed experiment, it's really to put context to some of the numbers that are there. Both the shutter speed and the aperture exercise is really to kind of connect a visual, connect an aesthetic, connect something that you can relate to when it comes to those numbers. 5.6 a thousandth of a second, they mean really nothing until you start to interact with it and start to sort of connect that to the consequence of the image. Then the next part in the equivalent exposures is where you're mixing the two. So you're choosing certain shutter speeds and then correcting it with an aperture. What you're doing there is working on this reciprocal relationship between the shutter and the aperture. As the time gets slower or longer, the aperture can get smaller. As the aperture gets larger, the time can get shorter. So, and then of course, intensity of the light can affect all kinds of different things as well. So to hold, you're really just kind of getting into the idea of movement. What can happen, however, is as you're doing these shots, a thousandth of a second is, I mean, you totally should be able to get everything stopped in its motion, because there's no, I mean, something happened 1,000 times in 1 second. Clearly, you'll stop the movement. However, they're not always in focus. So I don't want you to confuse when you're looking at these images, going over them and whatnot. Think that, well, something might be wrong because you shot it at 1,000th of a second, but it's not sharp. That can be two different things, really. Now, I don't think you have necessarily that issue. I mean, you do have images that are relatively sharp in certain areas. But here's what's going on with most of it being out of focus or blurry, is you've got this fast shutter speed. And so with the very fast shutter speed, you're going to have a very wide open aperture. You got 1,000th of a second. That camera's compensating by opening up the aperture really, really wide. By opening it up really, really wide, that diminishes the depth of field. It moves the depth of field down really, really shallow. And so therefore, you're trying to take a picture of something that's moving really quickly, and you have only just a thin plane of focus. This is a challenge. So even though you got 1,000th of a second, you're on a table, there's still a real challenge in terms of getting things to be in focus and getting things to kind of click just right. So lots and lots of repetition, lots of photographs. You have an advantage with the digital because you can you can see exactly what it is that you're doing. When I was working on this stuff back in the early 2000s with film, I mean, I had to pre-visualize what was going on, and pre-visualization, meaning kind of thinking about what you're trying to achieve before you actually get in there, is an important part of photography. Just like any other art form, you want to know what your intent is to go in. So anyway, when you're looking at these images, even though it's 1,000th of a second, the reason they may not be totally in focus, number one, is that depth of field. The other is you might be holding the camera, and because the thing is moving, you might not be critically focused. It's very difficult under those circumstances to actually focus on the object because it's moving. So you don't, you can't anticipate where the object's actually going to be. So the object that you're trying to identify may very well be completely out of focus, and you don't even know because it's not there yet. So these are two reasons why in some cases you have images here and they look out of focus and you're like, ah, man, I missed it. And that's just the nature of these kinds of images. These, I call them decisive moments. Well, I don't, they're called decisive moments. That was a term developed in the 60s by photojournalists, that they were looking for these like precise moments of action. Called the decisive moment. It was really connected to 35 millimeter photography when cameras got a lot smaller in the 50s and 60s, from these bulky metal things into these much smaller cameras. And then, so anyway, decisive moment has to do with this like moment before a collision is about to happen. It's really hard to capture that because you have to know and anticipate just when it's going on. So when you get into the longer shutter speeds, it gets even more sort of, it becomes more important that you're pre-visualizing and kind of preparing for what's about to happen, because you certainly don't know what the effect is going to be, because it's light. Light is moving during your exposure, because the light that the camera sees is the reflection off of the objects. And if the objects are moving during the exposure, so the camera's open and objects are moving during that time, it doesn't care that it's a stick. It just sees the light bouncing off of it. So again, lots and lots of testing to make these things happen. Now, your images, as you're making them, I think you've done a pretty good job of incorporating the table here. You've kind of lined it up fairly well. You've got other objects resting in place, so those act as a kind of a point of reference before you start to add the moving object. So this point of reference allows the viewer to kind of understand that this is about the movement, not necessarily just a blurry image. You juxtapose things that move and don't move. That's a really important part. The more you exaggerate them, I think the more effective they start to be. So you're finding that moment, right? Again, decisive moment where it either really clicks or it gets really far away and becomes a total abstraction. Here at the 1/8 of a second, it's almost all blurry. Sometimes you just wind up with images that way. You know, either you weren't quite holding the camera steady enough, or the objects just got a little bit out of hand. This really has a lot of energy to it. You know, it can work in some cases. You know, it's sort of like playing an instrument where you're hitting notes deliberately that are off key, you know, and if they're done in such a way, they can work. And so photography can happen in this way, where you get these beautiful swirls over here, like this. And moments like this, John, right here, this pine cone here, this is creating something called a notan, and that is this equal distribution of the positive and negative space within the image. And so what that means is that the eye is bouncing back and forth. Let's kind of move back into there. The eye is bouncing back and forth between the object itself, which is very dark, and then the negative space that's around it, which is the table behind it. The table kind of comes forward because it's so bright, so it almost looks like teeth, but at the same time you have this cavernous thing, and it's an optical illusion, and it creates this balance between the positive and negative space, which is what we call notan. It's a balance of positive and negative space. So it's wonderful when those things kind of happen. It's even more wonderful when you can plan them and make them happen. You know, color field, texture fields, that kind of stuff are quite lovely when you can get them to happen. These to me remind me a little bit of stage sets. I don't know why. They just really remind me of like a theatrical set. Really, I think you've done a nice job in handling the dark tones and letting the background fall completely off here. I think those are done quite well. Yeah. Again, you know, your movement objects are you know, you're doing a really excellent job when you're getting into the movement here. I'm actually, you know, the whole class has done a really great job in working with these heavy movement pieces. It's not often that you know, primarily the whole group gets involved to kind of succeed at this. So it just kind of clicked, I guess, this year where the majority of people got it. Now, I did notice down here when we started to get into your how deep that you had only just like very few examples, like for instance, this one and this one, and then we go to another image, presuming that you only had those two apertures to choose from, which, you know, I'm wondering, you know, what might be going on with that. I mean, it is demonstrating depth of field between this and this, but, you know, where are the in-between ones? That kind of thing. I'm wondering about that, whether those were the only two that you had to choose from or what. And then we kind of don't have any of the, I mean, there we're like kind of zoomed in or something. I'm not sure that we nailed this one just right. It looks like you got the first one right, but then we have some variations here that don't quite seem like it's the right experiment. So maybe we need to like figure that out. It looks like the first one you set it up properly, but then it kind of, the other ones don't seem like they worked out very well. So we'll maybe we need to loop back on that, and we can talk about that one later, like a one-on-one or something. But I mean, the aperture is really just, it's meant to give you that visual. Once again, it's really just a very straightforward exercise to set it up and then to run through your apertures to visually see how they change and what really the difference is between one f-stop and another, and how much or how little it changes. You know, how much do I lose when I go to, you know, from 5.6 to f4? How much less depth of field do I get? You know, is it a sacrifice, too much of a sacrifice, or what? So you kind of think about that. And I wanted everyone to be able to visualize that and how your individual cameras were able to handle it. Some cameras handle it differently than others, depending on the lens that's attached to it and the sensor and how it's accepting light and so on. Okay, so now we're doing the equivalent exposures, where this is really it's a math puzzle. Really, we wanted you to go in one direction with the shutter speed and the other direction with the aperture, and then vice versa, to kind of change things up and be able to kind of understand this reciprocal relationship. As time goes up, intensity must go down. As intensity goes down, the time must go up. So anyway, I hope I got that right. I probably got it backwards, but anyway, as one rises, as the time gets longer, the intensity then can be less. You can have a smaller hole as the time gets longer. As the time gets shorter, that aperture needs to be opened up and have a larger hole. There, got that right. So that was the main crux of this part of the exercise. And again, it was just an exploration compositionally of a variety of things. And these kind of are pretty dark, as you can see. Let me go ahead and bounce back out of there and get to your exposures one here. So you can see dark, 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 dark. I mean, overall, they're all dark. So you did manage to get them all equivalent, basically, but they all are equivalently dark. I think you could have gone up basically a little more exposure, about a whole f-stop more exposure. So that means, like, for instance, if you were at a 60th of a second, 1/60th at f8, that you could have stood to be at 1/60th of a second at 5.6, or increase the time to 1/30th of a second at f8. So either one of those would have been better, giving you more time or more light to brighten up the image. That said, you did seem to get the equivalent exposures correct, so that's good, and your compositions looked spot on. Here, you're taking more advantage of that dark, but in the differences that these seem to have a little bit more luminosity on the better. So yeah, kind of like maybe you figured something out during that first one and got to this second one. Quite a lot of people did this this thing, and I haven't seen it too many times except for this semester, where students were shooting through the bones like that. Maybe a couple of times in a bunch of years that people have done it, but this year, like several of you guys have done that. So again, must have been just a kind of a nuance there. These little details, I really appreciate how you're doing that. You're finding these moments. Photography is more about more like archaeology. Like you're discovering things that are already there rather than inventing things. Photography is like exploration, and so when you find moments like this, just you tend to lay things out and then kind of work around, and then through the camera, you can oftentimes discover things that otherwise you never would have seen. So these are just exquisite, really difficult for the eye to pick up on. Shallow depth of field, just beautiful color, this sort of flame going on here. Yeah, I'm really happy that you have found a kind of an aesthetic going on here. That the next step for you is really to think about what is it that you're interested. What do you communicating here? What's important to you? When you are looking at these images, what are you looking at? What is it that you are talking to us about? What are you talking to yourself about? What is it that you are discovering when you see these things and you decide, yes, that's it? You're going through the images and you're saying, this is the one I'm going to choose. What is it that's causing you to choose those, and what is it that you want us to get out of it when you see that? Asking yourself those questions, you may not necessarily need to get to a definitive answer, but it's that search and it's that questioning that you want to continually go for, so that it's kind of, you're asking the question, so therefore it prompts the viewer to ask the question. You can see almost that the photographs ask questions. And so that's what will start to happen when you start to ask your photography to do that for you. And it only does it for you if you ask it to. Basically, if you will it to, you say, I need you, photography, to do this thing. And I said, that sounds weird, but in a way, that's kind of how it works. So let's go ahead and take a look at your other posting here. Move up to the sun as, here we are, sun as the key. So this was the kind of a transitionary exercise where I wanted you guys to get out there. We worked in teams to kind of do a little bit of prep before I sent you out by yourself in the follow the sun exercise. And it's really to introduce you to some terminology, the different lighting, kind of the types of lighting, the deep shade, the open shade, the skylight, or, deep shade, skylight, and direct light, and then get you into looking at what window light is all about, to kind of just get you into looking what that is kind of what that might offer you. And what I'm amazed at with yours are that you managed to use the same subject over and over, which is really cool. Not a lot of students did that. I think maybe Maxine did that. She used her own objects and kind of repeated that over and over. You took that as well. You kind of almost denied the environment and used the detail and kind of made imagery on your own. But what we're seeing here is that you're more or less using the light as I think someone was walking in. You're using more or less the light to speak more about this object. Now, and they are. It is a flower, but it to me is reading more like a portrait. The way it's repeating, the way it's kind of like sitting there, kind of lazing there. To me, it feels a little bit more as if it's kind of looking at us here, like you're observing something here. And this is what I mean about what it is that you want to communicate to us. What are you asking the photography to communicate? And you're putting that into it. The photography is hopefully sort of able to translate that and then communicate that back out to us. Portraits are really difficult. Open shade is probably the most forgiving area to work in. So let's see, did you do this in the open shade? Let's see. Open shade, yeah, open shade. You were smart to do it in open shade. Absolutely. So that was a kind of a good way to kind of make it work. Here, you got some reflective light. I hope you learned a lot about how you can really take an environment that is not ideal and really just basically work with it, and make it actually more ideal. You don't need a studio to be able to create lighting like this. All you need is something to diffuse the light a little bit and a couple of reflecting objects. Window light is going to be a kind of setting that, if you do photography, if you're going to continue with photography, light from a window is going to be more and more a common thing that you'll likely want to work with. Professional photographers, believe it or not, use a lot of window light. They if you go into professional studios, commercial studios, you will see these studios have massive windows in them, and that's because they love to see that natural light pouring through the glass. There's nothing that can ever replace that stuff. So introducing you guys to just using the window as a key light, you hopefully were able to experience just kind of the type of light that comes through. Depending on where the sun is in proximity to that window, you're going to get a different quality of the light, depending on what kind of glass the window has, whether there's something diffusing it, how far you are away from the window when you're making the photographs. All of those things, it's a whole nother experience. So this was just an introduction, just to get you guys to kind of get in there and to use some basic tools at home to sort of say, hey, you know what? You can do a lot of the stuff that we're working on, even with just a window and a reflecting card. This hopefully will empower you to start to think about photography as, yeah, I got these things in the studio, and yes, I need to be in the studio, when I can, but when I can't, that doesn't mean I can't make photography and I can't do what I'm doing in the studio in other settings. I can really perform these same things either outside or inside by a window or in a restaurant, if that's what I'm being asked to do. So that's what I have for you. Hopefully you got something out of it. I just realized I had my binaural music going on in the background. Hopefully it wasn't too distracting, but I look forward to more of your images, and we'll see you in the studio. All right, bye now.